the first debate here at the climate stage. And please bear over with the fact that this is not a climate talk. This just happens to be the available stage for us. It's not going to be a climate debate, but on the other hand, I believe that climate may and will probably be one of the items we'll be discussing, how best to handle the climate change and the climate challenges on a European level, national level, or a regional level, or all of the three combined. Because these are the three levels we are going to discuss. Those of you who just watched the opening ceremony, did any of you watch the opening ceremony? You may have noticed that we had three speakers presented at the representing each of them one of the three political levels coexisting in nowadays Europe. The EU Commissioner, Ms. Vestager, who represents the federal structure, the European Union, a supranational authority. Secondly, the Danish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Kofod, who represents the national government, the national dimension of Europe, or nation-state dimension. And finally, the mayor of this community, Mr. Jespersen, the mayor of Mariager Kommune, which represents the regional or the administrative level of Europe. And Europe do coexist in these three levels or under these three aspects or dimensions: the federal, cross-national, the national, the nation states, and the regional or local bodies or authorities. These are the three dimensions that we will put light from to shape, should I say, the three-dimensional political map of Europe in the future. Some would argue, and some actually do argue, that the nation-state is too small and too weak to handle and solve the big problems in Europe, such as, for instance, climate change, security, defense, immigration, etc., other cross-country phenomena. And the nation-state is, on the other hand, too big and too distant, in some countries at least, to solve the near problems, such as, for instance, roads and parks, kindergartens, primary health care, etc. So this has led to the framing of the debate of the nation-state as sandwiched between the supranational and the subnational levels of politics in Europe. If decisions on local or regional matters are left to local or regional democratic institutions, and the supranational matters are taken care of by supranational institutions, why then keep the nation-state? This is what we're going to discuss the next 3/4 of an hour from a Danish point of view. All European nations have a similar discussion, but since we are gathered here in Mariager, we would like to share the Danish perspectives of the three-layer balance, or one may say the three-dimensional political map of Europe in the future. The rules are easy: 3/4, 3 aspects, 3 speakers. Each of the speakers will give us a short statement, followed by a discussion between the 3 speakers, who haven't met each other very much before, so this is not like a planned debate. We don't know what will happen. And following the discussion between and among the 3 speakers, I would like to invite all of you to take, not just asking questions, but come in with questions, remarks, protests, or what have you, as long as you keep it short, sharp, and to the point. Please let me present the 3 speakers. Next to me is Mr. Thomas Becker, the Managing Director of STRING, which is a cross-border cooperation on infrastructure and green investments in Germany, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. And I dare say that it's my impression that Mr. Becker is a federalist, advocating for a stronger Europe, governed as a democratic, supranational or federal structure. Mr. Anders Engberg is a historian and the publisher of the online magazine Europa on European politics and culture. It's an online magazine, you can all find it. Mr. Engberg has for years advocated for a new Europe of regions as a take on a more decentral, democratic political structure in Europe. And finally, as a sandwich between the federal and the regional level, we have Ms. Susanna Dyre-Greensite, chairperson of the People's Movement Against the European Union, in Danish, Folkebevægelsen mod EU, who, I dare say, is in favor of decisions being kept at the national and local and regional levels and not handed over to a union or a federation, if I'm correct. These are the three viewpoints or the three perspectives we are going to share a common picture of future Europe. That's all from me now. Thomas, please take us through your vision of a federal Europe without nation states, and perhaps a few words about strain meanwhile.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Is it on? No. Now it's on. Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you, and thank you, Chair. Well, it's a quite broad topic we have here. Yes, I'm a federalist. Absolutely. I think the relevance of the national state as we have them in Europe has passed it's the date. It's irrelevant in many senses. I think that most wars in recent time have occurred because of the national state. The national state is the reason for most wars, at least for the last 200 years. I do not think that you can leave important policies such as energy, such as climate change, to national states. They have shown to be immature. They do not have the maturity it takes today to run policy in the favor of its inhabitants. The populism is the overarching let's say mechanism in our European democracies at the moment, which is a big shame. Now let's just try to concentrate a little on, for example, energy policies as an example of why the federalism is more important. And I could talk about China and the United States and all that. Of course, that is another angle, but let's try to keep it very simple. I can promise you, we would never ever had the ETS system implemented in Denmark without the EU. ETS? Emission trading system, which is, you can like it or not, so far the most efficient mechanism to lower CO2 emissions anywhere, not anywhere in Europe, anywhere in the world. And that is acknowledged by all economists. You would tell me we haven't come far enough, there's a lot to do, but I can just je constate, like they say in French, that it does not happen on national level in Europe, because national policies are unfortunately very much run by populist movements in that direction and in that direction. The most mature thing you have right now is the EU Commission. The policies that are coming out of the EU Commission is by far the best work, the highest quality of any bureaucratic work that I have seen. It is simply the best people doing the best job. And who can be against that? So again, energy policy, as an example, climate change policies are simply too important to leave to small national governments that go in that direction, and that direction, and that direction. It's not the only reason why I believe in the confederation of European states. It is also because I want to be a world citizen. I do not want to be Danish. I don't care about being Danish. I don't care if somebody is German. I think we should be Europeans and ultimately world citizens, but at the moment we are, let's say, pressured by other forces that are autocratic or whatever, so that probably is a dream far ahead. But right now, and here and now, the best alternative, the best institution, the most security for us, being able to have our democracies, our thriving democracies, the biggest guarantee we have for that at the moment is not the Danish government, by far not. Maybe some of you saw television yesterday. It's what comes out of Brussels. That's why I'm a federalist. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Clear message. Anders, will you take us through Europe of the regions?
Yes.
Or the regions of Europe?
Hello? Oh, you can hear me. Fine. My name is Anders Engberg. As Leif said, I'm a historian and I'm connected to an online magazine called Europa.dk. There you can find it. And I've been dealing with European journalism for many years, making articles, making radio, podcasts, and also television programs. And many years ago I made some programs about different regions in Europe, significant regions in Europe, such as Bavaria in Germany or Catalonia in Spain and France, and Sardinia in Italy, and so on. And doing that, I was also in Northern Ireland. And I was speaking to a professor called Arthur, who comes from the second largest city in Northern Ireland called Derry in Irish and Londonderry to English. So there's also already a divide there. And he grew up during the Troubles in the 60s and the 70s. And those were the dark years. So that's what he took. That's what he meant. And he said, one of the things that he said was, this was in 2004, I think, or 5, something like that, and that I was talking to him some years after the Good Friday Agreement that was made and has secured more or less peace in that area for the last more than 20 years. He was hoping, and after that the EU was investing a lot of money into Northern Ireland, and he was hoping that this could go on further development. He said, I hope that we as Northern Irish people will look more to Brussels and to Belfast rather than to Dublin and to London. Meaning we should see ourselves as a region within Britain, of course, but also within Europe, and we should therefore look at Belfast and look at Brussels, and not so much be so nationalist, so that we either look, the Catholics look towards Dublin, and the Protestants and Unionists look towards London. And that was what he was hoping for. You can argue that he was not, the development has not been good to him and his vision for what has happened afterwards. But that was his vision, that you could do that. And this was also because nation states, as you all know, they are a historic phenomenon. 500 years ago, it makes no sense to talk about a nation state. And we don't know when, but of course, sometime there will be no nation states. There will be something else, we don't know what. You have a vision of something else. But it's a historic, part of a historic period, the nation states. And it's also what a famous nationalism researcher said, Benedict Anton says, it's imagined communities. It's communities that you imagine, that you are together with all those people and you have something in common with those people. But of course, this is an illusion. Yes. There is no Danish people, there is no Swedish people, there is no Portuguese people, because almost all nation states are heterogeneous. They have minorities and different regions that are part compared to the rest of the nation state. So it's an illusion, but it was, history has been used to create people like we are all Swedes in Sweden, we are all Danes in Denmark and so on, and it's been used in that way. How you can see it, you don't have to go that far. You were saying that we have a Danish starting point, and you have a border to the south that was created by a referendum in 1920, which is democratic and very unusual.
After 60 years of war.
Pardon?
After 60 years of war.
After 60 years of war, yes. And you have another border, our other border to Sweden, which is extreme in the other way, because it was created through war, and it was created through a brutal and long-lasting, how do you say, Swedification of the people living in southern Sweden today, or eastern Denmark it used to be. So the borders are
Artificial.
they're artificial, you might say, but they're also temporary. It's difficult. Of course, might be some borders 100 years, 200 years ago from now that still exist, but the borders 40 years ago were not the same in Europe as they are today, so why should it be the same 40 years from now? I'm not saying that they should be different, but I'm saying this is a dynamic time, so of course some borders might change. We must be open to that. My point is that we have a very diverse continent with a lot of minorities, a lot of different regions. Regions are different than most of the country that they're part of, and it is how can I say? It is the EU or an integrated Europe that can contain this diversity, because the nation states, their option was to create a picture of being that we're all the same, we're all Swedes in Sweden, we're all Poles in Poland, and so on, which isn't so. I once talked to a mayor in Brittany, in western France, and he said, in Brittany, or Bretagne in French, they have their own culture, their own language, and so on. He said, our friends, our allies are not in Paris, they are in Brussels, of course, because the French state wanted all to be French, and it was forbidden to speak Breton in the French schools at the time, and so on and so on. They all should be the same. The French language, that's the only language that prevails in France, and so on. But Brussels, there you have the exceptions. There you have the possibility. So it means that an integrated Europe is a Europe that has a chance of not fighting together, because there are all these diversities. Like, for instance, the Hungarian minority living in Slovakia. The Hungarians were reduced after World War I, and the Hungarians now live also in many other countries, neighboring countries. But the point is, when we are integrated in Europe, it is not really important whether you as Hungarian live in Hungary or you live in Slovakia, because you have all the political and cultural rights and so on, even if you live in another country as a Hungarian. And that's a very important point, and that means that if you look at the diversity and the regions of Europe, you have a much better chance of preserving peace and prosperity in Europe.
Thank you very much, and we'll get back to all dimensions. Susanna, your organization carries the words against the EU in its very name. How do you see a Europe based on nation states with no supranational bodies, or maybe just another supranational body than the European Union? Please.
Thank you. My name is Susanna. I'm the chairperson of the People's Movement Against the EU. We are a cross-party Eurosceptic movement, and when people hear Eurosceptic, a lot of times they think, okay, so you're a nationalist. Just get that out right now. I am by no means a nationalist. I am very much an internationalist. I just think that the EU is getting internationalism wrong. The reason we are Eurosceptic is because we are staunch supporters of democracy and self-determination. Basically, we believe that government with the consent of the government, not by technocrats in the European Commission that nobody voted for. We believe in preserving the Nordic labor market and welfare model and the protections that it affords workers and the flexibility that it extends to employers. We also believe that the Nordic welfare model is being threatened by the European Union's one-size-fits-all approach to labor market policy and to social policy. As an organization, we've been around since the 70s, and pretty much since then, we've been pushing for progressive environmental policies. And in fact, we often see the EU, led on by the EU Commission, being against the more progressive, both environmental and climate solutions. And finally, like I said, we are internationalists. One of the reasons we don't like the European Union is we believe it closes itself off to the rest of the world too much. At the same time, however, we do find the national level to be of great importance. Not because it's the only level that's important. I think that some welfare policies and whatnot should happen out in municipalities, and some health decisions should be made out in different regions so they can fit the people who actually live there. And I also think that we need international agreements if we're going to actually reduce climate emissions. That's a global problem, of course, and needs global solutions. Same thing for human rights supports. I think those should be international too. But there are some things that the national level can accomplish that the other levels cannot accomplish. One thing is democratic accountability. Who makes a law in Denmark? Well, the parliament does. Any member of parliament can propose legislation, and then the different parties that we voted for will discuss and finally end up on some decision. Now, Parliament decides a lot of things that I don't like. But if I don't like whoever's in charge at the next election, I can vote for somebody else. By contrast, when a law is made in the European Union, you have an unelected commission who is the only one who can propose legislations. And then yes, the European Parliament, who we do vote for, can make some amendments, and the Council of Ministers can make some amendments. But the primary force in the European Union is incredibly undemocratic. Also, all policies in the European Union need to live up to the EU's kind of constitution, right? The Lisbon Treaty. This wasn't something that any of us in here had voted for. There are also some other reasons I think more things should be decided on the national level. For one thing, even though we have a lot in common, obviously, with our EU neighbors, different countries have built their systems somewhat differently. I mentioned the labor market before. In Denmark, there's pretty broad agreement that it does not make sense to have a nationally imposed minimum wage. In a lot of countries, in Spain, a minimum wage makes sense. But when the European Union wants to go make the same labor laws for everybody, then it'll end up bringing us down to the lowest common denominator instead of letting the countries figure out what works best for their own citizens. Finally, there's the whole question of a community. We can say, sure, that we're Europeans, absolutely, but if we want to trust our government, we need to feel some sense of community with them. The best example of this happened during the COVID crisis, something that actually surprised me, because I think we're, modern society, we travel a lot, we're pretty European. But when COVID happened, where did we all look? Down to Ursula von der Leyen? No. We all looked to the people that we'd elected. We watched Mette Frederiksen on TV, Prime Minister of Denmark, and she was the one who proposed lockdowns. We had a different mask mandate than the one in Sweden. And what was important was that when we had a mask mandate, most Danes actually followed it. In Sweden, most Swedes followed what was said by their government. And that happened because they trust the government, because there is a sense of community. I'll just close off with a quote by a former MEP from my organization who said, the quote is Danish, I'll try to translate, "Et folkestyre uden et folk bare et styre." Folkestyre is another word for democracy. Literally translated, it means people's control. The people are in control. And people's control without people is just control. His point was that the European Union is just control. We aren't one common European people. We are different, we are diverse, and diversity can coexist, but when you try to have too many one-size-fits-all policies, you end up quashing the diversity encouraging it. Thank you.
Wonderful. I think we have a battle ready here. It didn't take many seconds of your speech, Susanna, before Thomas reacted and got more and more explosive during your speech. That's wonderful. We have a statement that nation states are an illusion and that nation states are a democratic community and transparent community. Thomas.
Yeah. Well, when I listen to Susanna, who has many very good points, I come to think of that you are the best friend of my enemy, because you are actually helping the xenophobic movement that is being undertaken in Europe right now. You ask for closer democracy. Well, why don't you then go to Switzerland, where women got voting rights, I think it's 2 years ago in one of the cantons. In Switzerland, they have close democracy. They have, let's say, the most rigid system in the world against foreigners, foreign workers. They treat them like cattle. They give them permits for 2 months' work and then they throw them home. There is no democratic, let's say, control whatsoever, meaning concerning human rights. It's a society which is extreme in its democracy and which is extreme in its selfishness, which is what will happen if the national state dwells into its own, let's say, being in itself not enough, without having to be influenced by the rest of the world and taking responsibility for what is going on in the rest of the world. And one more point, Mr. Chair. The Nordic labor market, you say that the Nordic labor market is being threatened by the EU. That is untrue. The only factor right now that is threatening the Nordic labor market, which I concur with you is fantastic, are the major corporations. Who is the best one to defending us against major transnational corporations? It's Margrethe Vestager. It's not our government. They do not have the resources to go up against Google, Amazon, all those that are threatening the labor rights. It is the EU Commission. It simply speaks for itself. So I do not, and minimum wages, it's a minimum. You can, as a member state, agree on any agreement on the level of salaries. But why should we not, that are so wealthy, be interested in helping American workers that are being misused in Spain? Do you not feel any responsibility for them? Do you not want to stretch out and say, we will help you here by being a member of this association, and say you cannot go below a certain amount of money? I think, as I started by saying, you are the friend of the best of the worst enemies.
Susanna shall reply to Thomas.
Okay. I absolutely feel a great responsibility to my neighboring countries, also to countries a little further away. I think you misunderstand me, because you're saying, oh, is it good enough to stay at the national level, to ignore the rest of the world, to go like this and ignore that we are living in a globalized society? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the European Union is doing it completely wrong, because the European Union is saying that internationalism has to happen in an undemocratic fashion, and that's just something I don't believe. So far as the current threats to the Nordic labor market model, you're choosing to ignore pretty much every single labor union in Denmark, except for like the kind of the ones that Danes call yellow labor unions, that are slightly different from the rest, and every major employers organization. The consensus is pretty broad that this is that minimum wage is a threat. As far as whether it will help the Spaniards, I mean, that's not what the European Trade Union says in its current form. Pretty much everyone's unhappy with the compromise that was reached on the minimum wage. Again, as far as helping xenophobes, I mean, that would be true if I joined them, but I mean, I don't see how asking for a more democratic international society by pointing out the flaws that are in our current European Union, by not painting a beautiful picture that doesn't exist of the great things the European Commission is doing. I mean, by the way, have any of these Dyre-Greensite policies actually held up in court? Not yet. I don't think that criticism in itself is dangerous. I do think that some flexibility, also at the national level, can have a positive impact at the international level. Let me give you an example. Yesterday, some of you can probably hear that I'm speaking in an American accent. I grew up in California. Yesterday, my home state of California just passed a bill that's going to outlaw the sale of diesel and gasoline cars by 2035. Now, Denmark can't actually pass a similar law here. There's a majority for it in Parliament. That's not the problem. The problem is that this issue is something that's controlled at the EU level. So, I mean, in my ideal world, Denmark would be able to pass the policies it wanted to pass, and then be able to inspire other countries to do the same, and we would be able to phase out our biggest polluters by 2030 or even sooner. That's something that the EU is currently stopping us, and criticizing the EU for that does not make me a xenophobe. It doesn't help the xenophobes. It's just bringing up what I think is a very necessary discussion.
On the other hand, how does it help that Denmark has a clean green politics if Poland and Germany don't?
It inspires other countries.
We inspire, but they have the right to choose their path. Germany and Poland.
Okay, just very quickly.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I'll keep it fast. So I think more national control on the climate issues is good for two reasons. One, you're able to pass more progressive policies if you have majority for them at the national level and then inspire other countries. Two, if Denmark wasn't part of the EU, we'd have our own seat at the United Nations when negotiating international climate agreements. When the Paris Accords, for example, were being negotiated, Sweden asked Norway to put forward some more progressive proposals that did end up getting passed because Sweden couldn't pass them in the EU. And Norway, which is not a part of the EU, had its own seat at the UN and was able to push this past. It's not the first time that's happened. So being able to have your own seat in international discussions and being a front runner nationally.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Anders?
Well,
First, Anders.
Sorry.
Anders first.
Yes, I just wanted to say that when you're saying, Susanna, that you are against the European level because it's undemocratic, and to a certain degree, I agree with you. There are many democratic problems within the EU, but on the other hand, as Thomas is saying, there are many issues that are needed to be solved at a European level. For instance, climates, for instance, big corporations and so on. The EU is not doing its best, it's far from doing its best. But when you believe that many issues should be solved at the international level, then instead of saying it's better that we do it at a national level, then you must say we must fight for reform so that it's more democratic at the level where the decisions regarding these issues should be taken. That is a very important point, I think, because I remember 30 years ago, people were afraid, the Danish left side of the political spectrum, that the refugee and asylum system should be taken care of by the EU, because they were afraid it would be much too restrictive and right-wing. The other things actually happened. But then you have to think, where does this belong, this political issue? It belongs at the European level, in my opinion, first of all, and then you must fight for the right decisions at that level. Well, that's my point.
Wonderful. We'll take another round here, but you can start preparing your own interventions. You're very welcome, and I'll invite you in a few minutes. Thomas?
Yeah, well, Susanna, I think what you're saying is defensive rather than you're not in the offensive. I mean, as Anna said, why do you not preach reforming the EU system, making it, because I think most federalists would like to see a democratization of the EU, meaning two chambers, the council and the parliament, and a government, perhaps elected directly, perhaps elected by the parliament and the two chambers. But of course, this is the development that the EU naturally will have to undertake in due time. And I think everybody understands that. That goes without saying. I hope that the efficiency of the EU, the fact that the EU Commission and the system around the EU Commission today produces the best laws in the world. I mean, not talking about if you like them or not, but the quality. The quality of what comes out of Brussels is just 10 times higher than what comes out of national governments. It's just a fact. You can't deny it. I hope that would be prevailed should we undertake a democratization of the EU, which of course I am strongly in favor of. When Susanna says that the EU is hampering our climate change policies and our energy policies, it's simply untrue. It's untrue. I've worked with it. I know. The most progressive proposals for the last 10 years when it concerns climate change, energy security, environment, anything that comes around that comes from Brussels. It doesn't come from us anymore. We live in this illusion that we are very progressive in the Nordic countries. In fact, in many cases we work together with Poland and Hungary when it concerns these matters. In particular, of course, when it's agriculture, we are, let's say, far right to Genghis Khan in the council. So it is an illusion that we are these green saints from the north, well preserved and rich and happy. It's not the case. We are actually somewhere in the middle right now. What we do have from the Danish side is my experience in the EU system. We punch above our weight class. We get more influence than we are supposed to, having a population of 5 million people, because we are quite smart. And we are not too tied up in bureaucracies and in institutional thinking, which is an enormous strength. This is why you have so many Danes in leading posts in the Commission, and this is why so many other EU countries are asking, what does the Danes think before they make up their mind? Which is fantastic. We should be proud of that. We have something to offer into the national and international society. But saying that the EU is hampering us is untrue. In fact, it's thanks to the EU that we have come so far that we have with our energy and climate policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. I'll take a short break and start asking you to do some reflections. We have the 3 levels to govern Europe and shape Europe in the future. The federal, national, and the regional. Which of the 3 forces would you prefer having the biggest power to govern your future on a European level? Could we make, just for fun, just a short noticing? If one of these 3 forces, the federal, the national, or the regional power, should be like, have the upper hand in the shaping of the future Europe, who among you would prefer the federal to have the strongest hand? Federal to have the strongest hand on European matters in the future? A few of you. Who would prefer the national level, the nation states of Europe, to have the stronger hand in the future?
Hard question.
It's a very hard question. Or the regional? It's a very hard question because you all probably are in favor of having all 3. And that's the future of us, that will have all 3 levels to coexist one way or another. This is not a this, that, or this matter. That was my point. In order to have your opinions, or your interventions, or your protests, these 3 guys do not agree. So it's impossible for you to agree with all 3 of them.
I do agree with him.
So please challenge the panel, ladies and gentlemen. Would some of you please dare? I have a colleague, co-host, who would hand you a microphone. Don't be afraid speaking in it. We'll have the gentleman on the first row. Thank you very much. Come up with the microphone. We have a gentleman here on the second row. Please, your name?
My name is Vicepresident, and I would like to ask a question that regarding the merits of scale that we obtain through the EU system. Because in a global context, Denmark is a small province. In America, there is the Bible Belt in America is 25 million people, almost 5 times the population of Denmark, who believes that the Earth was created in 7 days. So, in order for us to make ourselves important in a global context, the EU gives us a voice, even though it is shown to be too weak in questions of, in terms of energy, safety, and immigrations. How will we make ourselves heard? I guess this is mostly a question for you. How will we make ourselves heard in a global context as a community of 6.5 million people?
That's a question for Susanna, I guess. Would you reply, please?
Yeah, great question. And it kind of also gives me a chance to answer the two gentlemen shortly, because you asked why not just EU reform, because obviously you need some kind of European cooperation. We all agree on that, right? I also agree that we need some kind of European cooperation. I'll start first by saying what we can do at the national level internationally. Bear with me. And that's just to repeat what I said before. If we have our own seat at the United Nations, we can push for policies that are far more progressive than if we first have to agree with Poland. We saw it with Norway in the Paris Accords. We've seen it previously on environmental policy. The UN's Basel Convention on the transportation of dangerous chemicals was something that all the Nordic countries presented to the UN. The EU Commission said, hey, those dangerous chemicals are to be considered goods. There's free movement of goods. You can't be proposing to limit that. So the Nordic countries that were part of the EU pulled back their proposal. Norway went on with it and went on to actually influence global policy on that matter. So one is the ability to be more progressive. But obviously, if you step out of the European Union, and that's the first time I've heard that being a defensive position, I like it, I'm getting somewhere, if that's not offensive to want to leave the European Union, you obviously need an alternative. What we advocate for in my movement is joining EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, with Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. That is a pretty meaningful trade bloc. We also advocate for deeper Nordic integration. The Nordic countries are together the world's 12th, 13th largest economy. If we were able to negotiate trade deals through the Nordic countries, then we could actually push for progressive policies as well. So I'm not saying leave the European Union and leave everything to the national level. Leave some things to the national level that make sense to be at the national level, but then join some cooperations that are more democratically founded. And just very shortly, why not push just reforming the EU? It's already there. I really want to, but the problem is just it's so incredibly difficult to democratize the EU. Sometimes I go into my organization's basement and read some of our old materials from the 70s, the things that people were criticizing back then about the lack of democracy, the lack of transparency. Those are the same things that my organization and if the Green Party and the Social Democrats are still criticizing today. Because you can't just change the EU and make it more democratic. The EU's been changed many times, but it's always gone in the direction of giving elected officials less power and the supranational level more power.
Wonderful. We have 15 minutes left. There is time for all of you who may have questions, interventions, thoughts. Any of you? Please raise your hand. Please interact if you feel like. Otherwise, I'm sure that Anders and Thomas both have comments to the comment given by Susanna. Thomas first.
Yeah, I think there's one thing that is that we haven't touched upon sufficiently, which is I do not think that the EU should replace the closed what do you say, nærdemokratiet, the closed democracy. By no means. By no means. What I see these years developing is in fact regions that have collaboration with each other already, such as southern Jutland and northern Germany, where they have a natural cooperation historically. That those regions will develop into becoming powerhouses because they are not set up by borders that were made, some of them 300-400 years ago, for, let's say, military reasons, but let's say, the borders are created because of, does it make sense? Because of substance. There is a reason why certain regions in Europe, they find each other and work together. And that's the natural way. That's the way it should be. But nationalism and the national state as such is the biggest hindrance to that. And I know that for a fact that the whole EU system is very much pushing for the regionalization because the EU sees it as a positive sign that these groupings are being established across borders. Because the worst thing you can have in an international organization like the EU, which is a peace project, the EU is a peace project, is national borders, nationalism. I think I can see that many are Danes here. Just the fact that we have a prime minister who, since she took office, have started reusing the word danskerne. Look at the president, she talks about danskerne, which is something, when I was young, it was out of the question because we were so close to the Second World War. You couldn't say danskerne, that would be immediately somebody saying, that's nationalism. It has come into our language again. It's horrible. I mean, it's simply not covering me, saying I belong to this, and thereby I almost have a hostile attitude to those that are not dansker. It's dangerous.
You would prefer population or the
population? You didn't say danskerne, you said befolkningen. Befolkningen. You didn't use the word before. Those things have gradually come back into our society, and that will historically lead to a catastrophe. Look at what's happening in Hungary, Poland, those countries. Could happen here. Happening now in Italy. Salvini, what is his major project? He's against the EU. That's his major credo is, I hate Brussels, those bureaucrats, all these populistic sayings. Well, maybe Italy should start looking inwards instead and say, why is it that they cannot get this place to function and start paying taxes and all that? But they don't. They look at the EU, and this is a big flaw. This is very, very sad that the EU is misused like it is.
So the point is that the criticism to EU can spark nationalism.
Well, unfortunately, yes. Unfortunately, you can say that people that do not understand, and let's say that, let's just admit, we have had a whole group of population in Western Europe and in the United States that we have lost. We have simply not taken care of them. They were lost in the whole IT development, they were lost educationally, and that is a big democratic problem that we of course have to face. Also happening in Italy, also happening in Denmark, but that has nothing to do with the EU.
Thank you very much. I would love to hear your comment. This guy, wait for the mic please and share your name.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Rasmus, and I have several questions, but I'll just start with one of them. We talk about this, on the one hand, the national state that is depicted mostly negative because there's a lot more focus on one language and one way of being the correct something, Danish person and so on. And on the other hand, we have this description of you as all-inclusive of the small communities, but in the end, We still have a common language, that's English at this moment. And we still have something EU wants us to do together. So could we in the end, could EU be the new superstate? You know, could we end the same problem as at the national level? You know, I know that at least you, Thomas, expressed that there's, you know, we preserve these small communities and the minorities in the EU as it is now, but could we not go down a path where EU just became as the state, but just bigger? And if it gets bigger, it's hard to remove or topple if EU at some point says, well, now everyone has to learn English in the school. Well, now this local guy in what's it called, Britain, has the same problem as he has with France. Because there's something we, you know, as Europeans, you know, we want to learn English. We want that to be a thing to communicate. But what is this local area just says, no, we want to learn our own language, and our own language only. So how do we prevent us to being the new superstate or the new empire or whatnot?
The language case commence. Anders?
Well, I don't. It's not the official policy of the EU. That is for sure. I mean, diversity of cultures and languages and peoples and regions is very important within the EU. So, of course, there's you might say there might be a risk, but I don't see that risk. And I also wanted to say to you, Thomas, you started saying you don't feel that you're a Danish. That's not important. You're European. I think it's important also to be true to what you are. I think that's an important point. So I feel Danish. I am very much Danish, and I'm not even regional. I live in Copenhagen, and that's also how do you say, funny thing, because I live in the Øresund region, which really isn't an Øresund region. There is a lot of cooperation, but we don't feel like Øresund citizens. The people in Sweden, they go to Copenhagen because there's a big city, but the other way around, we don't know anything about, very little about Scania. So I would very much suggest that we make a promotion of Scania in Copenhagen to have a region there. Would be very, very interesting. But I think we should preserve, and I'm not against national identities. I think I have a national identity, and that is Danish. Some have a regional identity as well. In Sønderjylland, they have an important regional identity. But to me, it's important to find out where do the different political decisions, where should they be? What is the most practical and logical place to put those decisions? Because of course there should be decisions at a European level for many things, and at the national level, of course, and at the regional level in the future. It's not a question, as you were saying before, what do you prefer, one thing or another? I think that's very difficult to say. You should decide where do the different decisions, where should they be taken, and have that discussion. I don't know if that was an answer to you, to some extent at least, I hope.
But yeah, Susanna, we're not done yet from the stage. Susanna, please refer to Rasmus's question before he puts his next one. We have 5 minutes left.
I'll try to go fast. Rasmus, I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think to some extent it's already happening that the EU is becoming a symbol of nationalism just at an EU level. One thing is that they're forcing certain labor market policies down on different labor market models. You can also see how the EU is acting at its external borders. We right now pay and train the Libyan Coast Guard, which imprisons refugees, treats them absolutely horribly, and the EU continues paying. We do the same thing in Turkey. We deliberately ignore the Greek Coast Guard, which the EU taxpayers also pay for, when they perform illegal pushbacks. We are very much seeing nationalism at an EU level already happening. I'll compliment the EU, because, why not? One thing the EU's been really good at so far has actually been preserving different national languages. The EU's pretty good about allowing politicians and whatnot to speak in their own language. So I'm not too concerned about the language aspect, but the regional aspect, I mean, you're seeing EU diplomats having to perform very advanced diplomacy when they don't want Spain to break up, so they don't like what's going on in Catalonia and whatnot, but at the same time now supporting the Scottish cause, which they didn't before Brexit, and the EU doesn't like too much diversity, I would contend.
We're getting close to ending this debate. Rasmus, unless someone struggles against him, Rasmus gets the last question before we close up with closing remarks of the three of you, 1 minute each. Rasmus, just one more. Short and brief, please.
Fantastic, thank you. I like what you brought up there, Susanna, because you talked about what you did right when it comes to local languages. Thomas, do you have a certain, is there at some point where you believe that you influences us too much? I consider myself unfortunately a federalist. But I'm still like to hear you because you're such in favor of this great European community and all the things we can solve internationally and stuff like that. But where do you put your heel in the ground and say, stop, now you're influencing us too much on the local level or something, when they want to regulate, I don't know, lights down the street or something like that? Do you have a personal no? I would like to hear something about that if I can.
Wonderful. You can use your last 1 minute to that, and you will have 1 minute each to wrap up.
Thank you. Yes. Well, there were some examples in the past of ridiculous things that came out of the EU. I think that it's been tied up, and I really do think that most policies that are coming from the EU system. Remember, the Commission has the right to propose. Member state can encourage the Commission to propose, but the only institution that can propose new legislation is the Commission. They have that prerogative according to the Lisbon Treaty, which is very strong. Which is a very strong instrument. But coming back to your, if I may, two things. I think language is identity, and that identity is very important. That loss of identity of, let's say, harmonizing languages would be very negative to me. I love the Danish language. I love the Swedish language. I mean, that's very beautiful, and it's a sign of cultural diversity, which is quite important. So, and I mean that I definitely would like to preserve. The other thing I would like to say as an ending remark, Mr. Chair, is that my vision, so to say, in this debate here is that you, because obviously you cannot have the EU to be the only government. That's impossible. You need other institutions, you need municipalities. But let's say the level in between the municipalities or great municipalities and the EU system, to me, as my vision, would be that you exempt the national borders, and that you, which I think will happen in the future, you have regions with identities where it makes sense for that region to work together, where it makes sense, and not borders that are made out of history that was past history in a reality where we are by no means today. That is my vision. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Anders, 1 minute, and Susanna, 1 minute. Please.
I'll do it very shortly. Just one comment on what you were saying, Susanna, and also you, Rasmus, to some extent, that there could be a super state, something similar to what the nation states have been going through of making everything the same and homogeneous, and making everything the same language. In France, for instance, the last 200 years or so. In 1870, 80% of the French population didn't speak French. They spoke all of our other kinds of languages. Nowadays they do. So there's been an enormous process of that. And as you were saying, there was something about the external borders that could be criticized regarding EU, and probably so, but that, in my opinion, doesn't have anything to do with creating a super state or anything to do with a nation state, because it's another process. It's a process of making everything the same, and that is not how I see it culturally, linguistically, and otherwise. That is not the case regarding the EU.
Susanna, you get the last one.
Thank you. Well, I would contend that it is part of the creation of a nation state because you need borders. So how you police those borders is part of how you build a nation state, I would say. But that's a longer politological discussion. Anyway, I would just like to end off by saying that please remember that respecting national borders, believing that some decisions are better made closer to people, better made within our borders, is not the same as nationalism. We can cooperate with regions in our regions that make sense to cooperate in. We can push for things in the United Nations. We can keep things at a municipal level. That does not eliminate the importance of the nation state, and the nation state simply is important because it encompasses so many of the policies that we do have in common, and it is a democratic institution, unlike, unfortunately, the European Union. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I hope you feel just a little bit enlightened. You are the shapers of the future Europe, and I bet there will be a federal level of decisions, a regional level of decisions, and national levels of decisions. And I bet the nations won't be the same in 20 years, the EU won't be the same in 20 years, and the regions won't be the same in 20 years, because it's a dynamic system, and we probably have to live with all 3 dimensions. Thank you very much for giving 3 dimensions life, and thank you very much for participating. And there are more to these